position of Esau, what Isaac was feeling stopped him from wanting to do what Rebekah was requesting. So I want to just point out to one line in chapter 25, verse 28, where it says, "Vayehav Yitzchak et Esav," and Isaac loved Esav, "Kitzayid bepiv," because prey was in his mouth, meaning the sense of hunting. "V'Rivka ohevet et Yaakov," and Rivka loved Jacob. So I've always read this as something was wrong with Isaac, that he only loved Esau because Esau was a hunter, and there was some part of Yitzchak that did not want to feel his feelings, so he was very primally based on his gustatory desires. I'm reading it entirely differently, that Isaac decided to only want what Esau was good at because he could feel the devastation of his son, Esau, because Esau knew the secret knowledge that Rivka had, that Yitzchak had, if we're going to go along with the idea that he knew, and that Jacob had. Esau was the only person who didn't know explicitly, but he knew implicitly that he was not the chosen child, that he was not the favored child. Counseled enough families that I know that when one sibling's sense of self is determined by how they feel in the family structure, the one who feels that they don't measure up, the one that feels that they lack something that another sibling has, right or wrong, this is going to be devastating for the child and devastating for the family. This is the sibling rivalry that we're talking about, which is one of the themes of Genesis. And here's one thing I've learned as a counselor on the personal and interpersonal level. I think all of us can experience jealousy, which I define as wishing I had something that someone else has. Basic human desire to improve your lot, to covet what the other has in the sense of, I wish I had that. I define envy as, I can't stand that you have it. And in some deep psychoanalytic sense, I want to annihilate you that you have it. So you'll find this word in psychoanalysis. Again, I don't know if it's true or not, but it's a secret desire to annihilate those whom you envy because you can't stand that they have it. Now, at a more surface psychological level, it gets played out as resentment. And I try to imagine Esau living with the secret knowledge in his family that his brother Yaakov was born with something that he just didn't have. And his father Isaac tried to help him compensate by saying, son, I love whatever you're good at. But he knew that he simply had the deep favor of his mother Rivka, either because of the prophecy or just something between the mother and the child. So I want us to think about that, how envy and resentment play into interpersonal relationships. And here's one thing I've concluded. Although I think we can all experience jealousy, maybe a bit of envy, maybe a bit of resentment, I think it's actually somewhat characterological, meaning some people are simply more susceptible to envy and resentment than others. So one person can be, you might say, ambitious and want to accomplish, but it's not out of resentment or envy. They just like to bring honor to themselves. For other people, another person's honor for them is a devaluation. In fact, Martha Nussbaum, a scholar on Aristotle, and I've said many times I don't agree with some or much of what she's written, but she has a very deep insight that one of the deepest wounds that we can experience is the wound of being devalued. Now, for some people, when they feel devalued, it's their problem. It's something they say, well, I haven't accomplished enough, and I got to come to terms with who I am and what my envelope is and do the best I can and not compare myself with other people. It's part of psychological maturation. But when you look at what you might call the second original sin in the book of Genesis, you might say the first being disobeying the divine, which is, I think was a setup, but so I'm going to call the real original sin of Genesis was, of course, Cain's murdering Hevel, purely out of envy and resentment, which, of course, sets up one of the main motifs of the book of Genesis. If God had preferred Cain's sacrifice and not Hevel. Hevel might have said, well, I guess my brother did a better job and let me get at it. But Cain was the person that said, I cannot stand it that God prefers Hevel. God says to him, sin crouches at the door, im tetiv, if you work harder, it will not hold you captive. Cain rejects this and says, the only way I will feel better about myself is if I murder my brother. And we might call this the Cain syndrome. Yitzchak sees that Esau might have that character flaw. That Isaac says to himself, in my mind, if I don't take care of my son Esau and help him deal with his envy and resentment, he's going to kill his younger brother, just as our ancestor Cain killed Hevel. So one thing I think I see, and again, I'm trying to do a psychoanalytic interpretation of Yitzhak, he's protecting his son from the devastating consequences of what everybody in the family knew as a secret knowledge, but Isaac didn't want to see played out. Now, of course, Rebekah was the kind of person that said, I'm not going to sacrifice the truth to the feelings of my son. And this is another thing I think many of us do, and I think it can be done to a fault. I won't stand for the truth because it's going to hurt someone else's feelings. Try to imagine if you've done that or someone's done this for you. Just for a moment, think how disrespectful it is. The idea that you can't handle the truth, as opposed to, here's the sad, what I call the truth of the matter. When I teach wisdom work, what I call the observer mind, the objective mind, the rational mind, and the truth mind. Sometimes when you really want to get to the source of conflict with another person, internal conflict with other people, you get to what I call the truth of the matter. And a lot of our symptomizing is simply avoiding the truth of the matter about ourselves, about relationships, about other people. And why do we avoid the truth of the matter? Because it makes us so sad. And one reason people don't want to accept the truth of the matter, because it makes them feel devalued. It makes them feel less than another. It puts the onus of their internal sense of self on themselves oftentimes. No one's going to fix me. No one's ever going to love me enough. No one's ever going to value me enough. If I mortgage my sense of self to what other people do, if I wait for everybody to approve of everything I've done, then we are in for a life of abject misery. So one of the paths to maturation and fulfillment is not that we don't care what other people think, but that our ultimate standard of well-being is committed to a very strong sense of self. I'll put this in religious terms, that every one of us is a child of God. Every one of us is born with our own unique breakage as a human being. As I mentioned in my Shabbat thought, each of one of us is not an ish tam, an innocent, pure person, where each of us is an ish shavur, a broken person. We have to find our brokenness and understand the brokenness that we're born with and how sometimes life exacerbates it, and get down to the work of as much as we can of repairing the brokenness in ourselves and other people. Francis Fukuyama wrote in a 2016 book about identity and the problem of resentment is that one thing that happens in the world is that even if a person is not particularly born with the character flaw of resentment, it can be culturally taught and inherited. And Fukuyama thinks that this is one of the areas in politics. He was specifically trying to understand what we call the Trump phenomenon, the sense of displaced, damaged identity of white rurals in America. But then he expands it to just about, I'll say, many social conflicts can come down to a sense of being left out, of being displaced, of not being valued, and then being told it's someone else's fault, and then being told you have to actually worry about them. So as you know, in my mind, I think there's racism in America. I don't think there's systemic racism. I mean, I look at everybody around me. I look in our synagogue. I look at my jiu-jitsu club. I look at LAPD. I look at LAUSD. I don't see any systemic racism. I don't see any systemic homophobia here and there. So I think to myself, and sometimes when a person mentions to me systemic racism, I say, can you show me evidence? Can you prove it to me? It turns out it's a theory. It's like a religious belief. I think it's a terrible mistake. And by the way, this is rooted in critical theory, something that I used to object to, and now I actually want to spend my life undoing it, that the world is divided into oppressors and oppressed, and that if you can find yourself in the oppressed group, and by the way, that's part of what Trump capitalized on, is there's no systemic racism favoring white people. In fact, the displaced white people actually ought to be resented for the way they've been treated, that other groups are preferred. Now, I'm not saying that's true. I'm not saying that he actually ever said it, but that's what Fukuyama and many other people say. And then we realize we live in a country with a politics of resentment, politics of envy. We're oppressed, someone else has oppressed us, and we're supposed to hate the oppressor instead of looking at ourselves. And, this is a classic American ideal that I deeply believe in, especially the great advance in civil liberties, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Ultimately, we are responsible for our lives even if we encounter racism, even if we encounter unkind other people. We're not going to solve it. We're not going to persuade someone out of it. We can pass all the laws that we want. But ultimately, it's our resilience, our sense of self that puts us into the fight. Now, you can see where this is leading. As many people have said, the hatred of Israel is very much fueled by Marxian critical theory, that there are oppressors and oppressed, and the only true democracy in the Middle East, a country that treats its Arab citizens just about better than Arab country treats its citizens, is hated. And if you think at the values of political liberalism, I'm going to even say the political liberalism of the left, meaning the rights of the vulnerable, let's say the Arab minority in Israel, LGBT. On every level, Israel outshines all of its neighbors, sometimes to exorbitant degrees. In fact, when you, for example, look at Palestinian Authority in general and Hamas in particular. So on any measure of human goodness, Hamas fails to the point of being evil. Israel is the oppressor. All over the world, as many people have pointed out, including Noah Tishby in her book on Israel that I mentioned in my Shabbat Thought, she pointed out, there's almost nothing original in the book. I do want to mention one thing that I think her emphasis is great. Of all the countries in the world that do evil, of all the oppression in the world, there's only one that the world, the UN, cares about, which is Israel, which is prima facie evidence that it's anti-Semitism. If the only oppressor anybody in the world cares about is this fabrication of Israeli oppression, there's only one explanation, and it's hatred of the Jews. So I want to segue to that problem because I think that's a problem before us. If I were to count up all the emails that I get, messages that I get, Rabbi Finley, would you please talk about anti-Semitism? Now I'm convinced. I want to say a few words about it. What anti-Semitism does is it takes condemnatory attitude toward Jews that comes straight out of the New Testament, out of Christian teaching, that charges the Jews with deicide. The charge of deicide fulfills a human cultural function to have the other with a capital O. So the Jews become the other, capital O, European Christians. Now, when you think about it, when there aren't enough Jews to hate, right, then you have the religious wars in Europe. You have the 100 Years' Wars of the Protestants and the Catholics. You have the wars against the Catholics and the Huguenots in France. So you'll notice that all throughout European history is the drive to hatred. So when we focus too much on the history of anti-Semitism, I prefer to call it anti-Judaism because anti-Semitism was a word made up by German Jew haters to say it's about race, and they made up this thing called the Semitic race. We're stuck with the word, I just want to tell you, I don't like it because it's a word gifted to us, as it were, by German Jew haters. Okay, we're stuck with it. It's not about Semites. It's about Jews. I prefer to just call it Jew hatred. Probably not a very politic word. I remember when I was growing up in Hebrew school, and I learned what's called the lachrymose interpretation of Jewish history. So I was, learning Deborah Pessin's book on Judaism, and it's like one pogrom, one massacre, one burning the Talmud after another. So the lachrymose being the teary-eyed version of Jewish history. When I read more mature histories, if in one area there was a banishment, an expulsion, a burning of the Talmud, in other parts, actually Jews lived quite well, including Middle Eastern countries. So in the Lacrimosa interpretation of Jewish history, they always zeroed in on the worst case situation, decade by decade, century by century, ignoring how much murder and hatred was going on in Europe everywhere at all times. It wasn't really about Jews. I hope I'm not offending anybody here. It was about hatred. I mean, for example, I remember when I looked at the Khmelnytsky massacres in Ukraine, about how much the Ukrainians hated the Jews. Look what they did to everybody. The hatred was rife, universal in that part of the world. You want to see a really disturbing movie? Look at the movie called Hatred. Volhin, in the original, Volhin being the region of Volhynia, translated as Hatred. I think it's about 2016 movie. I want to share with you very briefly. It talks about the period with the German retreat on the Eastern Front and before the Soviet Union took control. The hatred between the Poles and Ukrainians hit a fever pitch. Now, what you see in the movies is the Jews are already murdered. The Jews are gone. The question was who gets their property. And then as you see in the movie, the hatred between the Poles, Ukrainians, and everybody else just rises up. And what you saw on October 7th in Israel happened in Volhin. Right? There are graphic descriptions of the exact same kind of atrocities and barbarism. As I've said many times, it was the Japanese official policy. You want to see October 7th played out day after day, year after year by the Imperial Japanese Army in China. Everything that we saw on October 7th was done by the Japanese to the Chinese, to the point of truly millions of people were massacred outright, and then millions of others died from starvation. 20 million Chinese died at the hands of the Imperial Japanese. The truly most rapacious colonial culture of the 20th century. And then you look at the Germans. So, although we have to worry about Israel because there's a promised genocide, I want us to take a long step back and say, this is the human condition. And the Jews are simply the canary in the coal mine of the human condition, fueled by resentment. And the resentment is, first of all, the in general resentment in Europe that the Jews did well once the restrictions were taken off of us. We rose to the top in many professions for all kinds of reasons. I think most of them cultural. However, as you know, this created great envy and resentment that was capitalized upon by many European leaders, European anti-Semites. You saw this in the Dreyfus Affair, and of course in the rise of German anti-Semitism, Nazi policy. It was based on the politics of envy and resentment, and therefore the idea, not dissimilar to critical theory and systemic racism, our suffering is because of an oppressor, and the oppressor is the Jew. Now, and therefore there's an eternal war between the Aryans and the Jews, completely fabricated, completely made up. Now, so we go to the politics of resentment, which is a card fueled by Marxian critical theory. That is you might say, the banner, the standard of Palestinians for whatever reason. I think there's deep envy and resentment that the Jews came back to Palestine and did so well. If the Jews came back to Palestine, just think about it, and Palestine was a culturally, industrial, advanced economy with a functioning judicial system, a functioning, as it were, federal or state government, where every peasant was in the middle class. And what you had were a bunch of desperately poor, miserable Jews eking out a living in the swamps. You think there would be this kind of hatred? It's fueled by envy and resentment. Then envy and resentment turns into a deep kind of loathing. It turns into a murderous loathing that we've seen for much of human history. So here's a point I want to make for those people who care about anti-Semitism. A person sent me an email, maybe perhaps you're here tonight. A person said to me, Rabbi Finley, should I post this on Facebook regarding anti-Semitism? There are X number of Jewish Nobel Prize winners in all these wonderful areas. And if you hate the Jews, then don't take the Salk vaccine. All these gifts of to humanity, the Jews. Have you seen this before? How great the Jews are? And I just try to imagine some Hamas Jew hater and says, you know what? I used to hate the Jews, but I just read they have 30 Nobel Prizes. So I guess I don't hate the Jews anymore. Or, I think of some recrudescent anti-Semite deep in Alabama. I used to hate the Jews, but it turns out they wrote some good books. They got Pulitzer Prizes. I guess I don't hate the Jews anymore. That's our myth. We want to make people like us by showing our achievements to them, not knowing it has the opposite effect. It just creates envy. Now, what if one thing that we've done? And I'm going to laugh at ourselves. If we make a hospital in Los Angeles for everybody, and we plaster Jewish names all over the wall, the non-Jews are going to walk in and say, look how nice the Jews are. So if you go and get surgery at Cedars-Sinai, you're going to say to yourself, I like the Jews. That's going to change the mind of an anti-Semite walking into a Jewish hospital? So we have this myth. If we just put Jewish names on every public service building, the anti-Semites will like us. Has that worked? Look at all the universities where people are saying, basically, kill the Jews. How many of these buildings are built by Jews? The foundations are given by Jews. I'm not saying we're not generous, and I'm saying we don't care about good things, but I do know there's a secret idea. If we're generous enough and tell the whole world that we're generous, they're going to feel grateful and not hate us. I've never seen that happen once, where an anti-Semite is talked out of their anti-Semitism because of the Jewish name on a building at a university. Okay? I think it's a fool's errand if we think that's how you fight anti-Semitism. Okay? Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't do good things. I definitely believe that there's any institution that doesn't make Jew hatred only come at a great cost, then we should pull our money. Carry on to all this is, you know the idea of the Jewish conspiracy and the Jewish power and Jewish money? Let's say it's true. Let's say it's true. Yeah, we have a lot of money. How do we use it? Ingratiating ourselves? Trying to buy our ways into people's gratitude? Money is power. So when you say to somebody, if you allow Jew hatred, we're pulling the money, then they have to have a reality check. Do I really think Jews are evil? Or I feel sorry for this oppressed group. And if they want to blame the Jews, let's blame the Jews. There's no downside to blaming the Jews. Just think about that for a moment. There's no downside to blaming the Jews until the Jews fight back. And when I say Jews, I mean every good person. Not just the Jews should pull their money out of Harvard. Everybody should pull their money out of Harvard. Now, why don't they? Why don't they? I think there's profound indecency for anybody to support any institution that permits that level of Jew hatred without profound, powerful, condemnatory disincentive to say, well, you get out there and do that. Now, one thing I see that is the Student Justice for Palestine, which is a Hamas-funded anti-Semitic group under this false flag of Justice for Palestine. It really means Jew hatred. They've lost their charter at many schools, but think how many places are getting away with Jew hatred. You know why? I'm going to speak very bluntly, because they feel sorry for people. Because they'll feel sorry for people. And if those people think that the best way out of their envy and resentment is to hate the Jews, let them hate the Jews. And you know when they're going to stop promoting that? When we disincentivize. So I don't think we face anti-Semitism by ingratiating ourselves to other people. I think we fight anti-Semitism by disincentivizing it. Because for most people, there's no disincentive to being an anti-Semite, to being a Jew hater. So I think of all the times in our country where a prejudice, as it were, wrapped up to a radical few, it wasn't because they were grateful. America didn't become less racist because they said, hey, there's a couple of good black people. Look at that person is a doctor. That person's a lawyer. This black is really smart. Is that the way racism ended in America? Because blacks paraded around a black doctor, black lawyer? No, it was disincentivized by law. That if you discriminate, you will get a lawsuit and you will go to jail. Nobody was disincentivized by racism because of admiration for a black person. In fact, I believe that when blacks succeeded, it fueled hatred of black people. It was disincentivized by law to the point that everybody got the memo. There's no incentive to this. It's ridiculous. It's abhorrent. It's disgusting. And if you continue with this, you will feel the long arm of the federal government on you, including, as Eisenhower sent down, the 101st Airborne Division is going to invade your city, and we're going to protect these people. They're going to go to your schools. We're going to federalize your National Guard, and we will hurt you if you hurt these children. It was the 101st Airborne Division that helped fight activities of racism, not white Southern admiration of black people. People say, I'm afraid to have my mezuzah out. I'm afraid that people will know that I'm Jewish. That's the opposite of what we should be doing. We should let everybody know we're Jewish. And if they look at us askance, look them straight in the eye. Now, I want to give you a fantasy of mine. I read that there was a bunch of anti-Jewish protesters under the guise of anti-Israel. And there was some Jewish students at, I forget which, a library somewhere, and they were banging at the door, and they locked the doors. And they called the police to escort them out through some kind of tunnel. Y'all read about that? Okay. Now, if I were there, and many of you, I would say to hell with it. I would say, let's break these chairs. Everybody grab a chair leg and open the door and say, yeah, you can come here and beat us up. But 8 of you will go home with broken noses. Come on in. You know what I discovered? Bullies don't like broken noses. They like to scare people and intimidate people. Many of you know my history. I spent many years growing up in Compton, California, and I was one of the last white kids at Roosevelt Middle School, and there was nothing short of pogroms against me and a few of the other white kids lasted at the school. And they used to call it a free-for-all and jump on the white kids. And some of us got beat up very badly. So one day I was being persecuted. I'm not exaggerating, probably about 50 thugs who wanted to beat me up. My buddy, black kid, because I was the only white kid, so all my friends were black or Hispanic, Daniel Lee. Remember Daniel Lee? Daniel Lee stood between me and a crowd of racist thugs who wanted to hurt me. One guy looked at all of them down and said, if you want to get to Finley, you have to go through me. I had boxed with Daniel Lee. We used to do this thing called, it's like slap boxing. Daniel Lee had some big hands and some big fists. We were in 8th grade, so he was a big 14-year-old. And I stood behind Daniel Lee, and I looked at these people looking at each other and says, who wants to get hit in the face by Daniel Lee? And you know what happened? They all walked away. I have never seen in my life such integrity and such courage to see one person stand up to 50 thugs and say, come through me if you want to get to him. Now, they could have killed us both, but no one wanted to feel Daniel Lee's fist right at the point between their teeth and their nose. Right? You ever been hit? You don't want to get hit. Daniel would say, okay, Finley, I'll walk you home. I didn't feel so great, but thank God for Daniel Lee. Now, what he didn't do was say, Finley, come up here and tell everybody all the great benefits white people have given to black people. He didn't do that. What he says is, if you want to hurt him, I will hurt you. So, how do we fight anti-Semitism? Let everybody know you're Jewish. You have a mezuzah, put up 2 mezuzahs. That if someone doesn't like a Jew, look you in the eye and say they don't like a Jew. Now, if it comes up, you've got to have your facts straight about Israel. That's for sure. I've had many conversations over my life. When I was at junior high school and high school, when I moved from Compton to Linwood, I met a lot of just old inherited Jew hatred. And, they said, you're a Jew. I said, yeah. And they said, you seem normal. I said, I am normal. Yeah, I talked, but I didn't hide the fact that I was Jewish. I let everybody know that I was Jewish, and I explained it. What is this thing, Jew hatred, and why this? And luckily I knew my facts. So here's what I want to say to you. Don't think that we address anti-Semitism by ingratiating ourselves to people proving how better we are. I think racial prejudices go down when they're disincentivized to what I'm going to call people who have the capacity to be normal, then you're left with the few truly evil racists, and we can deal with them. What we're faced with now, in my opinion, is making anti-Semitism not worth it. Making it not worth it. Where we show to people that for all the explanations that we can make about Israel, some part is intolerant. Now, a last little piece of what I'm going to call hasbara. Many people have said to me, Rabbi Finley, what about the occupation? Isn't that terrible? Rabbi Finley, what about Palestinian refugee problem? I can explain to you what happened. And Noah Tishby's book is a wonderful thing. Is one thing I want to say to you. She says very accurately, and I never heard this before. In the UN laws of occupation, laws of warfare, an occupation is only when one country occupies the land of another country. Palestine was not a country. It was assigned to be part of whatever the Arabs wanted to call it, but it was Arab. It was called the Arab Liberation Army. The term Palestine is, if the region is Palestine, the people were called Arabs. In fact, the first Arab, the Palestinian political organization was the PLO, and there was no occupation. It was the Jordanians who ruled it. She says, technically from the UN, you can't occupy a disputed region that's not a country. If you look at her book, I never knew this before, only 5 countries in the world recognize the Jordanian trying to annex what the UN said is going to be a separate Arab state in Palestine, whatever they wanted to call it. They could have called it Israel. We could have called ourselves Palestine. It doesn't really matter. There's a region called Palestine. They said, Jews, you can call it whatever you want to call it. Arabs call it whatever you want to call it. And Jordan, it's not yours. Jordan came in and took it. Nobody recognized it, by the way. It's disputed land. So when someone says to me the occupation, I say, occupation of what? Palestine. It's not recorded in any document in world history. There's an actual country called Palestine. It's called disputed territory. And if they want to create a country, come to peace with Israel and create your country. But there's no law against settling on disputed land because it's just a continuation of the 1948 law, 1948, I call it Palestine Civil War, which was about who runs the land. They lost the war, they lost another war and another war, but they don't want to subject themselves to the consequences of declaring wars and losing wars. Now, Noah Tishby considers herself a political, I say on the political left. That section of the book, roughly the middle section of the book is imperfect, but great. So if someone says to me, what about the occupation? I said, there's no occupation. It's called disputed territory. Now, it's an occupation when it becomes a country. Now, this is a little bit legalistic, but it's actually legally true. So anybody who says the word occupation does not understand international law. It can only be an occupation if it is an actual country. Let me give you an example. If Israel sent colonies to Antarctica, it's not called an occupation. No one owns Antarctica. If Israel sent colonies to the moon, it's not an occupation. I'm talking legally. I'm not talking about sentimentally, where, of course, there is Palestinians see it's our land. I get it. But I'm not backing down. I used to be nice about it. I used to say, yeah, you have a claim on the land. We have a claim. I'm not backing down. You know what? It's disputed territory, and you shouldn't have declared a war, and you shouldn't have promised to kill every single one of us. You shouldn't say you're pushing us to the ocean, and you shouldn't say Palestine free from the river to the sea. Number one, you don't even know what river it is, and you don't even know what that sea is. It's just a nice jingoistic phrase that means genocide. So I'm going to encourage you. What about the refugees? I feel sorry for them. I really feel bad for them too. But it was not ethnic cleansing because every Arab who stayed in Israel became a prosperous, fully rights-endowed citizen of a democratic country. There's no apartheid. And again, Noah Tishby makes this very clear in the book if you're looking for anything. So think about it. Ethnic cleansing when 20% of Israel's population is Arab. I think if we wanted to ethnically cleanse, we could have done a better job. There was no desire to ethnically cleanse. However, they were afraid. They were terribly afraid, and they were encouraged by their leaders to leave. Remember, because the invading army said, you leave, get out of the front lines, we'll massacre the Jews, come back in. Then they realized the war wasn't going so well, and they said, come back. Israel said, no. People said to me, oh, Rabbi Finley, wasn't that so heartless? The Jews said, don't come back? No, what are we going to commit suicide? We have an obligation to commit suicide? What country has an obligation to commit suicide? I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not ashamed of people that don't want to get murdered. I'm not ashamed of it. Now, we were willing to coexist. We were willing to take our part of the partition, you have yours. Arabs want to move to Palestine, Jews want to move from Palestine to Israel, fine. When you declare war and you evacuate so your armies can murder us, and you say, oh, sorry, can we come back? And we say no? Yeah, I feel bad. I feel super bad, but not bad enough that I wanted the Israelis in the state of Israel to be massacred. I don't feel that bad. And that's where we who support the state of Israel, I think we don't ever stop feeling bad. We are moral people and we feel bad for people who are so misled by their others, but not so bad that we think the state of Israel should have committed suicide. I don't feel that bad. Now, you know what I have found when I've actually said this to people? They go, yeah, I get it. Yeah, I wouldn't want my ancestors to commit suicide. Yeah, they declared a war. They lost. Consequences of war. Because I don't feel sorry. I feel sorry, but not so sorry that I think we should commit national suicide. Now I think about the campuses. What I think the answer is Jewish power. Right? Meaning what we saw in Washington, D.C., all those Jewish kids at those campuses, they should have been encouraged to come out strong and proud and shout right back at them. Right? And they should demonstrate. Remember back in the 60s and 70s, they should take over an administration building. And they are saying, we are not going to tolerate this racism. We're not going to tolerate this prejudice. We're not going to tolerate people threatening us. And that's when the administration wakes up. Now, what we've done so far is do a little bit of power play by saying, you want to hate Jews, don't take our money. Right? That works. And I'm not advocating we take over a building and take over a dean's office. I mean, I never liked that, and I never will like it. But what I'm saying, if you want to combat anti-Semitism, in my mind, the answer is not ingratiating ourselves. The answer is not appealing to moral sensibilities, although we have to be able to do that. The answer is we're not taking it anymore, and we will disincentivize it. Now, I might be wrong, but everything I've studied about world history, people act on incentives and disincentives. And if you want someone to change their mind, you can use all the rhetoric in the world. At a certain point, it might come down to incentivizing and disincentivizing. So I'd like to talk more about Noah Tishby's book tomorrow. I mean, there are some inaccuracies, a few falls, but it's outshined by that. And I think if I want to share with you how to read the book, I want to look at Barry Weiss's book on anti-Semitism. And I want to empower us both to make a case for Israel, but not be afraid to simply take a stand and say, I feel bad, but I don't feel that bad.